J.R.R. Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, as author of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was one of the most famous writers of the 20th century. He was also a soldier in the First World War. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War Bio special episode of Who Did What in World War I, today featuring J.R.R. Tolkien. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born January 3, 1892 in Bloemfontein, South Africa. His father, Arthur Reuel Tolkien, was an English banker at the Bank of Africa and head of Bloemfontein branch. His mother, Mabel, born Mabel Suffield, had followed Arthur to South Africa to marry him. In 1894, Tolkien's younger brother, Hilary Arthur Reuel, was born. Mabel took the two boys to England on a family visit when Tolkien was 3, but it became a permanent move when word reached them that Arthur had died of a fever. The family settled in Sarehole, a suburb of Birmingham. Ronald, as Tolkien was known, was homeschooled by his mother. He could read and write by the age of 4 and studied Latin, French, drawing, and botany. His mother and his Aunt Jane, who lived on a farm called Bag End, filled his head with stories and fairy tales, and Ronald began to imagine his own stories, populated with dragons and other mythical creatures. However, Mabel converted to Catholicism in 1900 over the protests of her family, and Ronald was then educated according to her new faith. He quickly learned Greek and a bit of German, and learning new languages became his passion. In 1904, Ronald's mother died from diabetes. Insulin was still in the future. And, triggered by her sudden death, at just 34, his personal Christian faith grew stronger. Ronald, who was quite pessimistic, believed in a great and powerful evil in the world. He learned Welsh, Old and Middle English, translated poems, and rummaged through libraries and bookstores for books. Now, when he was in his teens, 2 of his cousins had made up a language they called Animalic. Then one of them and Ronald made up another they called New Bosh, New Nonsense. Soon, Ronald would create the language Nafarin all by himself. In the summer of 1911, just after finishing school and before beginning his studies at Oxford University, he went on a holiday in Switzerland. Tolkien would say later in life that Bilbo Baggins's journey in The Hobbit is directly based upon Tolkien's journey in a party of 12 hiking and camping across the Swiss countryside. At Oxford, he initially studied classics, but eventually changed to comparative literature and English literature. He even studied Finnish and was captain of a rugby team, and would graduate in 1915 with first-class honors. During this time, he also got engaged to a woman named Edith Bratt. Ronald had known her and been in love with her for years, since the age of 16, but his guardian had forbidden him from having any contact with her whatsoever until he was 21. He obeyed this, and on the eve of his 21st birthday, wrote to Edith that he had never ceased to love her and wished her to marry him. They met, and she broke off another engagement, and she agreed to marry young Tolkien. They were engaged in January 1913 and married March 22, 1916. Tolkien would later say he was very impressed with her decision to marry a man with no job, no money, and a future that quite likely meant dying in the Great War. Okay, the war. He was still at Oxford when it broke out, creating new worlds of fantasy. But in October 1915, he enlisted in the Army. He graduated first in an officer training program and was assigned to a reconnaissance unit, and shortly after his marriage was sent to the front. The active war began for him with the Battle of the Somme, and he did not expect to survive it, as we know from his well-preserved war diaries. He noted in them, during his frontline stretch in the trenches as a communications officer, that he seemed to be seeing the same fight between good and evil again and again. Now, at first, he was certain the Germans were evil and described them as barbarians, but he would soon revise those thoughts, realizing that on all sides there is both good and evil, and moreover, there are only human beings. Tolkien's university friends began dying one by one in the war, and he would express his loss and pain in poetry about his experiences. In late 1916, he began to show the symptoms of typhus and was sent to Birmingham for treatment. In hospital, he began outlining a new world, one that had passed but had a great deal of the debris of history, myths and legends which would later form the basis of the Silmarillion, the foundation for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He also invented 2 new languages which would be included in his later works, the Quenya, based on Finnish, and Sidarin, derived from Welsh. After the war, He moved his family to Oxford and began his academic career. Nearly all of his friends were dead from the war. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about how his months at the front may have influenced his creative work. His biographer, John Garth, confirmed some of this conjecture and in 2003 published a book on Tolkien and the Great War. But though creative work is great trauma therapy, and a guy who makes up languages is certainly creative, it would probably be wrong to say that Tolkien's stories would never have existed without the war, even though the dead marshes of Mordor might remind one of the trenches of the Somme. For example, The Lord of the Rings, you can pretty clearly distinguish what is good and what is evil. But in Tolkien's real war experience, it was an animalistic horror, where there was evil on all sides. And the evil was not just confined to people. It was a world in which you could no longer rely on any traditions or beliefs. Tolkien took his inspiration from life in general, the poems and fairy tales of his youth, the people he had known, and the Great War was only one part of that. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was one of the most successful authors of the 20th century and was professor of the English language at the University of Oxford. Not only in his most famous works, but in all of his work, even his early poetry, you can see his extraordinary imagination. He died September 2nd, 1973, 2 years after Edith had passed away. On their gravestone, in addition to their names, are names Tolkien gave them, Luthien and Beren. In Middle-earth legend, Luthien forsook her immortality to be with the mortal warrior Beren, and when Beren was captured by the Dark Lord Morgoth, she rode to his rescue. When Beren was slain by the demonic wolf Carcharoth, Luthien appealed to the Valar, the order of angels placed in charge of the world by Eru, and persuaded them to restore her beloved to life. That was how he saw his true love for his life, Edith. I think I'll just end right there. If you want to find out how other artists coped with their experiences of World War I, you can check out our special about art and the Great War right here. If you want to find out more about the war's influence on Tolkien, check out the book I mentioned earlier in our Amazon store. If you buy the book there, you also support our show since we get a commission for each purchase. Tell us who you want to see covered in another biography episode, and don't forget to subscribe.